It is a little after midnight in California. The freeways have finally gone quiet. The last late diners are drifting home, the porch lights are switching off one by one, and across a stretch of land holding tens of millions of people, the world is settling into sleep. In the high-rise apartments of Los Angeles, in the hillside homes above San Francisco, in the desert resorts of the Coachella Valley, people are climbing into bed, setting their alarms, and closing their eyes, certain that the sun will rise on an ordinary morning. But tonight, deep beneath their feet, something is about to change. Down in the dark, locked rock of the San Andreas Fault, a century and more of stored pressure has reached its breaking point. The two great plates of the Earth's crust, jammed together for generations, are about to tear free, and when they do, in the dead of night, with the cities asleep and unprepared, it will unleash the most violent few minutes the modern West has ever known. This is the scenario emergency planners quietly dread the most. Not a daytime quake, when people are awake, alert, and able to react. A nighttime quake, a rupture that strikes when the population is unconscious, when the streets are dark, when there is no daylight to see by, and no warning to act on. Because when the San Andreas snaps at night, the disaster does not just bring destruction. It brings darkness, confusion, and a race against a clock that will not stop ticking until the sun finally comes up. And in the hours between that first jolt and the first light of dawn, some cities will face a night so catastrophic that by sunrise they will be almost unrecognizable. In this video, we are going to live through that night together. We are going to walk through 7 California cities as the fault ruptures in the darkness, and see why each one faces its own particular nightmare in the hours before sunrise. We will follow the disaster minute by minute, from the first violent shock to the long, terrifying wait for dawn. Some of these cities you know by name, others you may never have thought about, but every one of them sleeps tonight above the same slumbering giant. And every one of them could wake to a world transformed. Stay with me until the very end, because the last city on this list faces a danger in the dark that almost no one talks about, and understanding it changes how you see this entire threat. #midnight, the giant stirs before the ground moves. Let us understand exactly what is waiting beneath California in the darkness. The San Andreas Fault is not a crack that will swallow the state, no matter what the movies have told you. It is something both simpler and more menacing. It is the seam where two vast slabs of the planet's crust meet, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, grinding past each other in slow motion, in opposite directions, at about the speed your fingernails grow. For most of the time, that movement is invisible and silent, because the two plates are locked together by friction, pressed against each other like enormous blocks of stone that refuse to slide. But the deep forces pushing them never rest. Year after year, the rock along the fault bends and strains and stores that relentless pressure, winding tighter like a spring with every passing decade. And eventually, inevitably, the friction loses. The rock snaps back into place in an instant, hurling out all the energy it has hoarded for a century or more. That violent release is an earthquake, and on the San Andreas, it can be one of the largest earthquakes the continent is capable of producing. The southern stretch of the fault is the part that keeps scientists awake at night, and for good reason. It has not unleashed a truly great earthquake in more than 3 centuries. 300 years of pressure, quietly building, with nowhere to go. By the fault's own ancient rhythm, mapped out by geologists who dig into the earth and read the scars of quakes going back thousands of years, the region is not merely due for the big one. It is overdue. Every calm night that passes is not a night of safety. It is another night of energy piling up, another turn of the spring, guaranteeing that when the release finally comes, it will be enormous. So imagine that release happening now, tonight, in the small hours. In the worst modeled scenarios, the rupture begins deep underground near the southern end of the fault and tears northward for more than 200 miles, unzipping the earth in about 2 minutes. 2 minutes does not sound like long, but in the middle of a great earthquake, it is an eternity. The shaking in the hardest hit places would roll on for a full minute or more, long enough for a sleeping person to wake in terror, realize what is happening, and still have to endure it as their home comes apart around them in the pitch black. And the energy would not stay near the fault. It would surge outward, funneling into the soft sedimentary basins that cradle California's great cities. Bowls of loose earth that trap the seismic waves and shake everything on top of them harder and longer than solid rock ever would. And here is what makes a nighttime rupture so uniquely dangerous, the reason planners lose sleep over this exact version of events. During the day, people are awake and alert. They can see the danger, react to the first jolt, move away from windows, take cover, run from a failing building. At night, all of that vanishes. People are unconscious when the shaking begins, disoriented in total darkness, fumbling for glasses and shoes and doorways they cannot see. There is no daylight to guide an escape, no clear view of what has collapsed and what still stands. Downed power lines lie invisible on the ground, live and lethal. Broken glass and fallen debris fill dark hallways. Someone trapped under rubble cannot be spotted from a distance, and someone searching for them cannot see where to dig. Every single challenge of a great earthquake is multiplied by the simple, brutal fact that the disaster arrives in the dark, and will stay dark for hours before any help or any daylight can come. Now, with the giant awake and the ground beginning to heave, let us go to the cities. Hashtag number 7. Palm Springs and the desert in the dark we begin, where the rupture likely begins. In the desert, in the glittering resort communities of Palm Springs and the surrounding Coachella Valley. This is one of the most beautiful places in California. A landscape of palm trees and swimming pools nestled against dramatic mountains. And it sits right on top of the southern San Andreas, in the very zone where scientists believe the next great rupture is most likely to start. Because the fault runs directly along the edge of this valley, the communities here would be among the first to feel the quake, and they would feel it at full. Undiluted strength, right at the source. In the darkness, the shaking would arrive without warning. Sleeping families would be thrown from their beds. Older buildings would begin to fail, and the pools that define this desert paradise would slosh their water out in great waves as the ground rolled beneath them. But the deeper horror of the Coachella Valley at night is what comes after the shaking stops. This is a desert ringed by mountains, connected to the rest of Southern California by a handful of highways and mountain passes. Those passes are exactly the kind of terrain that fails in a great quake. Buried under landslides, their bridges collapsed. In the dark, the valley could find itself sealed off completely, a bowl of destruction with every route in and out choked with rubble. And because this is a desert, nearly all of its water and power arrive through infrastructure that crosses the fault zone. Sever those lifelines in the middle of the night, and you have hundreds of thousands of people trapped in the dark, with no water, no power, and no way for help to reach them. They would have to survive the rest of the night alone, waiting for a dawn that would reveal just how cut off they truly are. Hashtag number 6. Indio and the sleeping East Valley just down the road lies a cluster of communities that receive far less attention but face an even harsher version of the same nightmare. Indio and the eastern Coachella Valley are home to large working populations, sprawling farmland, and a region that can swell enormously when it hosts some of the biggest outdoor gatherings in the entire country. Picture the cruelest timing. The fault ruptures in the dead of night during one of those massive events, when the desert is packed with people who do not live there, who are asleep in tents and temporary lodging, who have no supplies and no idea where the exits are. In the darkness and chaos, with the ground still heaving, panic would spread through a crowd of strangers with nowhere safe to run. The roads that brought them in would be shattered, the temporary infrastructure would fold. Even on an ordinary night, the Eastern Valley is uniquely exposed. Many of its structures were built quickly and cheaply, and older buildings are especially vulnerable to the long, violent shaking a great San Andreas quake delivers. Emergency services here are thin even in daylight. After a nighttime rupture, with roads gone and communications dead, these communities could wait for days before real outside help arrives. And when the sun rises over the desert, it brings a new threat with it. Because in a place where daytime temperatures can climb past 115 degrees, survivors with no water and no shelter would find the very sunrise they long for turning into a slow, scorching danger of its own. Indio is the quiet tragedy of this scenario, a place that would suffer terribly in the dark and be left to bake through the day that follows. Hashtag number 5. San Bernardino and the choke point in the night now. We move to a city whose peril comes not just from the fault beneath it, but from a single mountain pass nearby that holds the fate of all Southern California in its grip. San Bernardino sits at the foot of towering mountains, and a place where the San Andreas carves a dramatic line across the land. And just to the north lies the Cajon Pass, one of the most important and most frighteningly vulnerable pieces of geography in the western United States. Through this narrow mountain gap runs an astonishing concentration of lifelines, a major interstate highway, vital railroad lines carrying goods across the nation, aqueducts carrying water, fuel and gas pipelines, electrical transmission lines. Almost everything that flows between Southern California and the rest of the country squeezes through this single passage, and the San Andreas Fault crosses it directly. When the fault ruptures in the night, the ground in the Cajon Pass could lurch many feet sideways in a heartbeat, shearing through every one of those lifelines at once. The highway would split and buckle, the rail lines would twist and snap. The pipelines could rupture and, in the darkness, ignite into fires visible for miles. The aqueducts would crack and bleed out. In one instant, in the dead of night, the main artery connecting Southern California to the outside world would be cut. For San Bernardino itself, the shaking would be ferocious, collapsing vulnerable buildings and trapping sleeping residents. But the greater catastrophe is what the severed pass means for the millions downstream who depend on the water, fuel, and supplies that flow through it. Cut the pass in the dark, and you begin to strangle an entire metropolis before it even wakes. San Bernardino is the choke point, the one place where the lifelines of a civilization gather in the exact spot the Earth is most likely to tear them apart. Hashtag number 4. Palmdale and the fault beneath the beds head into the high desert north of Los Angeles, and you find a city built almost directly on top of the beast. In the Palmdale region, the San Andreas is not some distant line in the wilderness. It runs right through the area, so close and so exposed that geologists come here to study the fault with their own eyes. Standing on ground twisted and folded by millions of years of grinding movement, to live this close to the fault is to have no buffer at all. When it ruptures in the night, the sudden sideways displacement of the ground, potentially many feet in an instant, could pass directly beneath homes and streets and sleeping families. Anything built across the fault line would be torn in two as the two halves of the earth slide past each other. This is the rawest form of earthquake destruction, and few populated places in California are more exposed to it. But Palmdale carries a hidden significance that makes it even more critical. This region is a vital junction for the aqueduct system that carries water south to the vast population of the Los Angeles basin. Some of the most important water infrastructure in the state crosses the fault at or near here. When the ground moves in the night, those aqueducts, which cannot possibly survive a sudden 30-foot shift, would be severed. In a single dark moment, a major share of the water supply for millions of people to the south would be cut off, potentially for months, because repairing an aqueduct torn apart by fault movement in rugged terrain is agonizingly slow. So Palmdale faces a double blow in the darkness. It sits directly on the rupture, guaranteeing severe local devastation, and it holds the water lifelines whose failure would cripple the sleeping megacity to the south. When dawn comes, Palmdale may be too broken to help itself and too damaged to help anyone else. Hashtag number 3. Los Angeles and the city that wakes to fire, and now we come to the giant. Los Angeles is one of the largest urban regions on the planet. Tens of millions of people spread across a sprawling basin of freeways, neighborhoods, and towering downtown skyscrapers. And though the San Andreas does not run through the heart of the city, that offers far less comfort than you might hope, especially in the dark. Los Angeles sits in a deep sedimentary basin, that giant bowl of soft earth we talked about. When the seismic waves from a great rupture come rolling in from the north and east, the basin catches them, traps them, and amplifies them. The shaking across much of the city could be far stronger and far longer than the distance to the fault would suggest. In the middle of the night, high-rise apartments would sway violently for a minute or more, their sleeping residents jolted awake into swinging, groaning towers. Older concrete buildings, and the region has many, could collapse in the dark onto those inside. Freeway overpasses could pancake onto the few vehicles still moving. But the true nightmare for Los Angeles comes after the shaking. Remember the severed lifelines. The aqueducts crossing the fault at Palmdale and beyond, cut the interstate routes through the Cajon Pass, cut the gas and fuel lines feeding the basin, ruptured. Los Angeles imports the overwhelming majority of its water from far away, and nearly every one of those routes crosses the San Andreas. In an instant, the region could lose most of its imported water, and local supplies would not last long against the thirst of millions. Now add fire to the darkness. When the shaking ruptures thousands of gas lines across the basin at the same moment, flames erupt everywhere, blooming orange against the black sky, and when the water mains have been shattered by the same quake. The fire hydrants run dry. Firefighters would face an impossible night, a city burning in countless places at once, with almost no water to fight it. History teaches that in great earthquakes, it is often fire, not the shaking itself, that causes the worst devastation, and a nighttime rupture is the perfect recipe for it. Help from outside would struggle to arrive, because the roads leading in would be broken and jammed, the airports damaged, the ports crippled. A city of millions could be left in the dark for the rest of the night to fend for itself while the water runs out and the fires spread from block to block. Los Angeles will not slide into the sea. But by the time the sun rises through the smoke, large parts of it could be burning, waterless, and unreachable. Hashtag number 2. Daly City and the cliff's edge at night. Now, we travel hundreds of miles north to a city that lives more intimately with the San Andreas than almost anywhere else on Earth. Daly City, perched on the coast just south of San Francisco, sits so close to the fault that in some places the boundary between the two Great Plates runs nearly through the neighborhoods themselves. This is where the fault comes ashore and slices right along the edge of the peninsula. This is the northern segment of the San Andreas, the same stretch that produced the catastrophic earthquake that destroyed much of San Francisco more than a century ago. That historic disaster was born on this very section of fault, and the fault has been silently reloading its energy ever since. For Daly City and the communities along this coast, the danger is proximity in its purest form. Being this close means enduring the maximum intensity of shaking and facing the direct threat of the ground rupturing at the surface. Homes and roads built across the fault trace would feel the full force of the earth tearing sideways in the dark, and the coastal geography sets its own night traps. This is a narrow strip of land, densely built, connected to the rest of the region by highways and bridges that would be brutally tested. Along the coast, unstable bluffs already prone to erosion could give way in landslides during the shaking, taking roads and homes down toward the sea in the darkness where no one could see them coming. When the northern San Andreas finally releases its century of stored energy again, the communities clinging to this beautiful, treacherous edge of California would be among the first and hardest hit, caught in the black between a churning ocean on one side and a tearing fault on the other, waiting for a dawn that would reveal how much of the cliff and how many homes had vanished in the night. Hashtag number 1. San Francisco and the night it has seen before. And so we arrive at the top of our list, at a city whose very history was forged by this fault in exactly this way. San Francisco is one of the most iconic cities in the world, a place of steep hills, gleaming towers, and one of the most famous bridges ever built. It is also a city that has already been destroyed once by the San Andreas, and nearly everything about its situation suggests it remains dangerously exposed to a repeat, especially in the dark. The great earthquake that struck this region long ago did not simply topple buildings. The shaking ruptured gas lines, and the fires that followed raged for days, devouring vast swaths of the city while firefighters stood by helpless, their water mains broken and their hydrants dry. It became one of the deadliest and most destructive disasters in the nation's history, and it was caused by a rupture on the very same fault system that runs past the city today. That fault has been quiet for well over a century, and all the while the pressure has been rebuilding. Modern San Francisco is far larger, taller, and more crowded than the city that burned before, and much of its most prized real estate sits on filled land, ground created by dumping earth and rubble into what was once the bay. This artificial ground behaves horrifically in an earthquake. When violently shaken, that saturated, loose soil can lose its strength entirely and flow almost like a liquid, a phenomenon that causes buildings to sink, tilt, and topple. The very neighborhoods that suffered worst in the historic quake, the ones built on made ground, would likely suffer worst again, and at night, the collapse would come in total darkness, with residents asleep inside. San Francisco faces the same brutal isolation as everyone else, only sharpened by the night. It is a city on the tip of a peninsula, dependent on bridges and a handful of routes to connect it to the wider region. Its water travels from distant mountains through pipelines that cross the fault. When the northern San Andreas unleashes the energy it has hoarded for more than 100 years. San Francisco could face shattered water systems, widespread fires with no water to fight them, buildings collapsing on liquefied ground, and severed links to the outside world, all unfolding in the pitch black, with rescue unable to cross the water or the fault. It is the city that history warns us about most clearly, the place that has already shown, once before, exactly how this terrible night can end. And tonight, millions sleep there above a fault growing more overdue with every passing hour. Hashtag hour by hour until dawn to grasp why a nighttime rupture is the version of this disaster that experts fear most. You have to follow the clock through the darkness, hour by hour, and feel how long the wait for sunrise really is. In the first 60 seconds, the ground does its violence. Across hundreds of miles, in 7 cities and everywhere between them, people are hurled awake in the pitch black by a force they cannot understand. Buildings that were going to fall, overpasses that were going to buckle, gas lines snap and begin hissing invisibly into the night. And then, when the shaking finally stops, there is a moment of unearthly silence, deeper because it is dark, broken only by car alarms, breaking glass, and the first frightened voices calling out for family members they cannot see. In that silence, the survivors reach for the light switch, and nothing happens. The power is gone. They reach for their phones, and the network is overwhelmed and failing. In an instant, tens of millions of people are cut off, blind and alone in the dark, with no way to know what has happened beyond the walls of their own room. In the first hour, the emergency response tries to begin and immediately slams into the wall of the severed lifelines and the darkness. Fire trucks roll toward the glow of burning buildings, only to find roads blocked by rubble they cannot see clearly and hydrants that produce nothing but a trickle. Ambulances cannot reach the injured because the freeways are broken and the surface streets are jammed with terrified people fleeing into the night on foot. Hospitals, many shaken and damaged themselves, running on backup generators, are flooded with casualties faster than they can be carried through the doors. And the responders, the firefighters and medics and police are stretched beyond any possible limit because a rupture of this scale does not create one emergency. It creates tens of thousands of them, all at once, all in the dark, spread across a region the size of a small country. By the deepest part of the night, the outside world is frantic to help and runs into the cruelest bottleneck of all. How do you even get in? The airports may have cracked runways, the ports may have shattered docks. The highways, the ones that cross the fault, are severed at the crossing points. Every route into the disaster zone has been compromised by the same event that created the need for rescue. And so the aid gathers at the edges of the catastrophe, close but unable to reach the people trapped in the dark interior. This is the gap the survivors were always warned about, the space between the disaster and the arrival of real help, and at night, it feels endless. As the hours crawl toward dawn, the situation grows more desperate in the hardest hit zones. Without running water, thirst becomes a genuine threat, especially in the desert cities. Without power, there is no light but fire and the stars. Without communication, rumor fills the void and fear multiplies. And the aftershocks come, some of them powerful earthquakes in their own right. Each one rattling the already broken buildings and bringing down structures that barely survived the first blow. Each one a fresh jolt of terror to a population that has not slept and cannot rest. When the first gray light finally touches the eastern sky, it does not bring rescue. It brings only the ability, at last, to see. And what the survivors see in that first light is a landscape transformed, a world that went to sleep whole and woke up broken. Hashtag the long shadow of a single night, even after the sun rises and the true scale of the disaster becomes visible. The story is far from over. A great earthquake on the San Andreas would not be a single terrible night that the region shakes off in a week. It would cast a shadow stretching for years, reshaping the lives of everyone it touched. Consider the water. When the aqueducts that cross the fault are torn apart in the dark, they cannot simply be patched by morning. Repairing major water infrastructure severed by fault movement, often in remote and rugged terrain, is a monumental task that can take many months. Through all that time, cities of millions would survive on emergency supplies and whatever local reserves they could find, rationing every drop, unable to return to anything like normal life. A modern city cannot truly function without water, and the image of a great metropolis limping along for months on a fraction of its normal supply is one of the most sobering parts of this entire scenario. Then there is the economy. These 7 cities and the regions around them make up an enormous share of one of the largest economies on the planet. When they are crippled, the damage does not stay local. Ports that handle a vast portion of the nation's imported goods could be knocked offline, snarling supply chains across the entire country and far beyond. Businesses would be destroyed, jobs erased, and the bill for rebuilding would climb into numbers almost too large to comprehend. The financial aftershocks of the big one would ripple outward across the nation and the world long after the ground fell still, and there is the human cost that never fully fades. Communities scattered, homes lost. Families changed forever by a single night when the earth reminded everyone who is truly in charge. History shows that great cities do rebuild after great earthquakes. San Francisco rose again from its ashes, grander than before. But the rebuilding takes a generation, and the memory lingers far longer. The people who lived through that longest night would carry it for the rest of their lives. And the cities they raised back up would forever bear the mark of the darkness they survived. Hashtag the longest night, so picture it now. All of it happening at once, in the same few minutes of darkness. Palm Springs and Indio thrown into chaos in an isolated desert valley right at the rupture's starting point. San Bernardino watching the fatal chokepoint of the Cajon Pass tear apart. Palmdale straddling the fault as the water lifelines of a metropolis are severed beneath it. Los Angeles waking into a basin that traps the shaking and a night lit by spreading fires with no water to stop them. Daly City clinging to a crumbling cliff at the fault's very edge. And San Francisco, haunted, burning again on ground that turns to liquid. 7 cities, hundreds of miles apart, all struck in the same instant, all plunged into the same darkness. What binds them together is the cruel arithmetic of a great earthquake striking a modern society at night. Our cities are kept alive by invisible threads, water, power, fuel, roads, communication, all flowing in from somewhere else. And in California, a staggering number of those threads must cross the San Andreas Fault to reach the people who depend on them. When the fault moves, it does not sever one thread at a time. It cuts them all at once, in the same violent instant, across hundreds of miles. That is why help will struggle to arrive before sunrise. The very act that creates the emergency also destroys the pathways rescue would travel, and the darkness makes everything worse. Search and rescue teams cannot see. Survivors cannot find their way through rubble-strewn streets. Downed power lines lie invisible in the black. Fires spread unseen until they are enormous. Every problem a daytime quake would create is multiplied by the simple, terrible fact that no one can see. This is why emergency planners repeat the same urgent message again and again. In the hours and days after the big one, you may be entirely on your own. The roads may be gone. The stores may be dark and unreachable. The taps may be dry. The phone's dead. The power out across the whole region. Outside help, no matter how desperately it is trying to reach you, may simply not be able to get through. Not for hours, not for days. The true first responders on that longest night will not be distant rescuers and convoys. They will be ordinary neighbors, pulling each other from the wreckage in the dark, sharing water, and holding on together until the sky finally begins to lighten in the east. Hashtag waiting for sunrise. It would be easy to end this by saying these 7 cities are doomed to vanish before the sun comes up, but that is not the truth, and it is not the point. The San Andreas will snap. That much is certain. The plates will keep grinding, the pressure will keep building, and one night or one day the ground will heave in these cities, along with the millions who call them home. Will face the greatest test of their existence. But whether they vanish or endure is not yet written. The difference between catastrophe and survival is decided long before the shaking ever begins. It lies in buildings reinforced to sway instead of collapse. It lies in water systems built with flexible joints that can bend across a moving fault instead of snapping in two. It lies in families who keep enough water, food, light, and supplies to last a week or more with no outside help, and who know exactly what to do when the ground starts moving in the dark. It lies in communities that know their neighbors and have a plan for the night the lifelines fail. Preparation is the one thing that can turn a vanished city into a city that simply survives a very bad night. The people of these 7 cities sleep tonight above one of the most powerful forces on the planet. A slow-motion collision that has been unfolding for millions of years and will not pause for anyone. Most of them will never think about it. The sun will set, the freeways will empty, and life will go on above the silent, straining rock. But deep below, in the dark, the spring keeps winding tighter. Somewhere down there, in the locked heart of the southern San Andreas, the countdown to the big one is already running, and when it finally reaches 0, whether tonight or years from now, the only